Welcome everyone who's in the room, and also those of you who are on Zoom as we live stream today. I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at NYU School of Law. This is our regular guest speaker program. Before we begin the program, I want to make a little advertisement or promotion for our annual dialogue on rule of law in East Asia. It will be this year on Friday, October 21st, and the subject is promoting women's rights in East Asia and globally. And we're going to be talking, one of the issues we'll be talking about is the impact outside of the U.S. of the Dobbs decision on women's reproductive rights. And we'll also talk about international law's role in promoting and protecting women's rights and the effect of transnational women's movements. So please come. It's also going to be hybrid, virtual, and in person on the 21st of October. So today's topic is equally timely. We're looking at the spike in attacks, including violent and increasingly deadly attacks against Asians and Asian Americans since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and what can be done to better protect the Asian American and Pacific Island community, or the AAPI community, and especially what lawyers and what the justice system can do to better protect this community. So our guests are partners at Paul Weiss who have taken on pro bono work to represent the victims or surviving families of victims of anti-Asian hate attacks. So Jennifer Wu is a litigation partner at Paul Weiss with a focus on patent litigation. She frequently tries cases in federal district courts and at the International Trade Commission. She also argues appeals at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and represents clients at the Supreme Court. Ms. Wu is Paul Weiss's sponsoring partner for the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and a regular contributor to Paul Weiss's amicus briefs before the Supreme Court. And very importantly, she's a 2004 graduate of NYU School of Law. And Lawrence Wee is a corporate partner at Paul Weiss, focusing on capital markets, financial transactions, securities, regulation, and restructuring. He's been recognized by the Legal 500 as a leading capital markets lawyer, as well as by Lawdragon as one of their 500 leading U.S. bankruptcy and restructuring lawyers. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and according to a recent article I read, is also a pastor in an Asian American church.
I preach there from time to time. I wouldn't say I'm completely in New York City, actually.
Which I bring up only because it seems to be a bit of the part of the story that we're going to be telling of how the two of you became involved in this work, your top community, and that's the reason I bring it up. So so welcome to you both. I'm so excited to have you with us and to share your work, and also a lot of the information about what can be done about the situation. As I mentioned, there's been a spike ever since March 2020 with the start of the COVID pandemic. And one set of figures that I saw, this is from Stop AAPI Hate, is that between March 2020 and March 2022, more than 11,400 hate incidents of all kinds against Asian Americans were reported across the United States. But of course, we know there's underreporting. People don't report everything that happens, just some small percentage. So the reality is even more, but that number alone is pretty horrific. And this is up fourfold, fivefold from pre-pandemic. So this is the situation in which you've stepped forward to do this kind of pro bono work. Could we start with an actual case that you've maybe handled recently or still working on, in which you represented either the survivor of an attack or the family of a victim who was killed in an attack? You can anonymize it if that seems appropriate, but just tell us what happened roughly and what you've done as lawyers, what your services have been for your client in that situation.
Sure, maybe we'll start with the Michelle Go case. So Michelle Go was the woman who was in Times Square subway when she was pushed to her death in the subway. She was a Deloitte consultant, pretty much the same age as the folks sitting in this room right now. Very bright woman, very connected to the community, was a volunteer for homeless people. She was not somebody who was an illegal immigrant. She was not somebody who sort of, kind of existed on the fringe of society. If anything, she was a young professional who was just walking around. And she was unfortunately pushed to her death by a gentleman who was later found mentally unfit to stand for trial. Someone who had been in and out of the sort of mental institution system, in and out of the justice system in New York City. The way that we got connected to her was that this is actually going back to my NYU days. I had competed in a moot court competition while I was at NYU called the Thomas Tang competition, which is run by the Asian Bar Association. And one of my judges, and I'd done it on a whim because I wanted to go to Hawaii and the finals were in Hawaii. NYU had said very graciously that had I kind of gotten to go to the finals, that they would pay for the ticket. And I remember going, at the time it was Dean Sexton. So, I'd gone to Dean Sexton and explained this. And he was like, sure, like if you guys make the finals, we'll put your bill, like the $600 ticket, which at the time like a lot of money for me. And I think, I existed in a strange world already in NYU because my first year was 9/11. And so it's like many of you who kind of lived through the pandemic here, it's very odd to kind of go into a community and then all of a sudden have your world be shook. But the result of that is that you're very good friends with the people who are like with you in the snow globe as it got shook, right? So immediately kind of in my first year, 2 weeks in, all of a sudden I was best friends with everyone in my section because we lived through 9/11 together. We were in crim law class with Professor Chevigny. We left and we watched the towers fall. So we were all very close. And one of the consequences of that was I actually lived near the World Trade Center, could not go home. And I went and told Dean Sexton. He immediately gave me a room in D'Agostino. And so I had this kind of pre-existing relationship with him, who remembered me as the girl who couldn't go home and had no clothes or whatever it was. She said, sure, if you make the finals, we'll pay for your ticket to Hawaii. So without any moot court experience and without really any litigation experience, I entered this competition and ended up winning it. And I don't think that I had, perhaps like, I wasn't the most prepared for sure. We didn't have the best brief. I wasn't the best oralist, but we were really good at responding on the fly and just being very direct to people. And one of the judges in that competition was Marilyn Go, who is a magistrate judge in the Eastern District of New York. And she watched me argue, and then she became my mentor. And that happened in 2002 or 3, right? It was a long time ago, 20 years ago almost, that she became my mentor. And I invited her to my wedding. I got to know her family. And it all stemmed from this one moot court experience when I was here at NYU, just randomly because I wanted to go to Hawaii. And then I went to Hawaii and she was there. And, I hung out with her a little bit and she was, gave me a good perspective on law, which is your career is 40 years old. It's not about what summer associate job you get. It's where you want to practice long term and what brings you joy. Right? Because she said, she wouldn't have expected that she would have become a magistrate judge, but she did. And that's, it brought her joy. So bringing it back to the hate crimes issue, she was connected to the Michelle Go family. So out of the blue, she emailed me and said, I know you've been doing hate crimes work. We had represented the Yao Peng Ma family, which is the family of the gentleman collecting cans. We represented the Guiying Ma family, who was the woman who was kind of beaten while she was sweeping outside. We eventually represented the woman whose husband was killed by the duck sauce killer. But we had sort of a track record, when the Michelle Go killing happened, of running families. I was involved in the Asian Bar Association, had written some white papers about the rising tide of Asian American violence. So she gave us a call and said, I'd like to work with you on this. We think you can help. And I think that it was a compliment that she did that, but it was also indicative that we in the legal community haven't found a way to serve Asian American communities. Like as a patent litigator, I don't think I'm anyone's first choice to do civil rights law, right? I'm not saying I can't do it, but I think we haven't found a way to serve the communities of color who need us. And it may be that we have legal aid. It may be, I think Professor Estreicher always calls it the Cadillac rickshaw problem, that we have rickshaws for people who are really poor, and we have Cadillacs for people who can buy, $1,000 legal services. But in between, for the Michelle Go family, who are a middle-class family, her father's a lawyer, really a tax person, but a lawyer, never practiced law. Who represents them? Who takes care of them? And who can they find to really, stand with them in these times when you're not indigent and you're also not, really, really wealthy? And so I think we fit into that category. So that's how we got started. I'll hand it off to Larry for what happened next.
Yeah, and so it was really, really a moving story about how Michelle really impacted her community positively. She was well loved, and no one had anything bad to say about her. And so when the family came to us, client intake is all about figuring out what the person needs. What does this family need right now? It's not about imposing our schema or our thoughts on the situation. Oh, this is a hate crime, and so we need to do all of this. Because ultimately, we are in a client service business. And that's why, we need to think about, why am I an attorney? Why am I an attorney? Because I want to help my client get what they want. As long as it's legal. And, and so different clients will want different things. Some clients want to say, oh, this is a hate crime. I want to prosecute this to the nth degree. I want publicity. I want this. I want that. Other clients are, in the middle, and they're saying, I don't know if this is 100% a hate crime, because one of the things that, and you pointed this out many times, is proving that something is a hate crime, or even getting to the point where the DA is willing to charge someone with a hate crime is difficult when, a lot of the folks that are doing these crimes are on the fringes of society, and they don't have the Facebook page, and they don't have the manifesto on their website or whatever it is, and they won't say horrible things while they're committing the crime or while they're getting arrested or whatever it is. And so it's often difficult, right? I mean, there's actually pieces of the law that needed to be changed.
Right. So the law requires that to prove a hate crime, that hate be a substantial or whole part of the motivation for the crime. And I think I've explained this before this way, which is it's really hard to prove why someone hates someone. And the same reason it's really hard to prove why someone loves someone. When you ask someone, well, why do you love your mom? I don't think that you can say it's because she's a woman, or because she looks like me, or because she's a good cook. There's no singular motivation for human emotion of love. There's also no singular motivation, I believe, for hate. And so because the law is written in a way that requires a singular motivation, at least in New York and California, not in other states, but in these states, it's incredibly difficult to prove a hate crime. And so when you see the community going out picketing and saying this is a hate crime, prosecutes a hate crime, really angry, I don't fault the community for saying that, but they're sort of pressing on the wrong person. The district attorneys, by and large, would prosecute as a hate crime if they thought they had the evidence to prove it. A lot of these kind of attacks on Asian Americans and Asians are done without any talking or speaking, right? There's no warning for Michelle Go. There was no indication this guy ever said anything to her. He didn't say, I hate you because you're Asian, or I'm going to go hit an Asian woman. He simply just pushed her. And where there's a lack of evidence, you have to assume that in a criminal trial, the jury may not find that they're guilty behind a reasonable doubt. And then add to this that a hate crime is only a penalty enhancement. So for a particular sort of assault charge, it might raise the assault charge a little more, but by and large, for most of the crimes we've seen, hate crimes only add 2 more years of jail time. And so for most victims and most district attorneys, it's not worth going after that prosecution for the minimal sort of enhancement. It's not a standalone crime. It won't throw you in jail forever. It won't get you out of, not being able to have bail, right? It's simply penalty enhancement. And the extra evidence you need is really getting into the defendant's head. And the reason I think that this is important to explain is because the media focuses on the hate aspect a lot, which means we talk almost all the time about the defendant and what they believed and what they thought and what they wanted. And we don't focus on the victims. And that's what Larry and I are here to do, which is to give them the space. Like all the media ever wants to know, like CNN, ABC, all of them, right? All they want to know is, was it a hate crime? And what was he thinking when he murdered that woman?
Although not everybody.
Although not everybody.
There's
certain people in the community, right, who would want to hear that. But very few people want to hear from the victim, like, how did you feel? Are you okay? And, their first question is like, was it a hate crime? Right. And so I think that the reason that the community focuses on hate crime is a good one, is that we enhance the penalty for hate crimes because a hate crime is a crime against the community. We've determined that certain kinds of crimes, like cross burnings, like attacking sort of synagogues, attacking Black churches, that there are certain kinds of crimes that are so pernicious that an attack on one is an attack on all. And so for those crimes, we've determined to enhance the penalty. But over the years, the penalty enhancement isn't enough to deter these kinds of crimes. And so when the community demands the hate crime, they're demanding it from themselves, but they're not demanding it for the victim. And so the way in which this played out for the Michelle Go case was that there was a huge Times Square rally where they showed her picture, they showed her face, and they did a rally and they said, this is a hate crime. It wasn't, by the way, a hate crime because there's no evidence of it. And the family wasn't informed that this was happening. And they were devastated that her image was being used to represent hate on Asian Americans when they didn't even know what the motivation was. They were still working with the district attorney. They'd met with the mayor. They had met with, various people in power. None of them had any evidence. And because Michelle had volunteered for the mentally ill and for the homeless folks, they didn't necessarily want it to be perceived as a hate crime because they weren't sure it was. They weren't sure it was. And so there was a real divide in the Asian community, or kind of in the community, between the Asian community organizations that were so keen on announcing this as a hate crime. Asians are being hated and that's why they're being killed. Even though from a legal standpoint, it wasn't being prosecuted as a hate crime. And the family felt that that actually victimized them further by taking advantage of their grief.
Yeah, and that's why, when, the approach that we're taking is so important, because you as an attorney or a client's attorney, you have to remember that every single time. And so, while we may think one thing, the client may think something else, and we have to help them, in some ways process that. I don't want to, and so Jen and I, we don't impose any kind of schema on these folks who are coming to us. We just say, what are your goals? Some folks don't want any publicity at all. Some folks, want to create a foundation and go out and fight for causes. Some people think, oh, well, I don't know if this is a hate crime or not, but there sure is a pattern, and the reason that hate crimes need to have attention is that in this country, the reason that, at least that I think, that there's this rising tide of hate crimes is not just a rising in number, but they're rising in severity. That where before COVID, someone might call you some terrible name, or they might harass you or follow you or intimidate you or whatever it is, maybe might spit on you or whatever. Now it's, I'm going to beat you with a rock. I'm going to push you in front of the subway. I'm going to shoot you with a gun. I'm going to stab you. Those are the sorts of things that happen. I'm going to push you downstairs. I'm going to do things like that. And the thing that COVID has done, together with the rhetoric around COVID, is that there's this invisible killer that no one can do anything about at the time. Thankfully, we can do something about it now. But at the time, there's this invisible killer circulating throughout throughout society. We can't do anything about it. And it was those Chinese folks who unleashed this on us. And so since they unleashed this deadly killer on us, I have the license to go out and do violent things to people I think who are responsible for it.
Let me just go back to the Michelle Go case. What are some of the specific things that her family did want you to do for them, since they did engage you then as their lawyers? What services did they need and want?
Well, on the criminal side, when we can talk about that.
Yeah, so most people, this goes to kind of why you even have hate crimes, but there's a lot of distrust between sort of general population and institutions that are supposed to protect us. So many of our victims distrust the hospital, the coroner's office, the district attorney, the mayor, the president, even the police, all the city council people, because a lot of people have an agenda, right? They're almost trying to use these cases to promote their political agenda.
And some organizations actually try to profit from it.
Because these families are raising enormous amounts of GoFundMe money. And so you have these families who, originally might not kind of come to the forefront. And all of a sudden you have this family who, Michelle Go probably raised $500,000 overnight, it seemed like. That's a lot of money. So a lot of people are going to come out of the woodworks and look for it. And then if you're a politician, you want to be seen at these rallies. I think Eric Adams spoke at the Michelle Go rally, right? Because he wanted to be seen as standing in solidarity with the community.
Although some politicians, I must say, are very sincerely supportive of.
Right, Grace Meng is, I think, the gold standard of like proposing hate crimes legislation. Others,
give her a shout out.
right? A lot of politicians, maybe don't have that level of commitment, but they want to show up just to be seen around these issues. And so one of the things they wanted was how to interact with Alvin Bragg and the district attorney in Manhattan. They were from California, Michelle Go's family, so they had no real connection with the district attorney. And these cases are assigned to individual ADAs. And we actually got a great ADA who we continue to have calls with now. And he was very upfront that this case may end up with the defendant being found mentally unfit. But in that moment for the family, they want to know what they can do about it. And like, is it right? And who's evaluating them? And what's going to happen? Do they need to show up? So one of the things about being a victim, I hope none of you are a crime victim, is that legal proceedings are designed to protect the rights of the defendant. Almost every hearing you have is about kind of like, motion to like, sort of suppress evidence, like motion for like, violation of constitutional rights, and you presume innocence, right? You presume innocence. And so at all the hearings, defendant gets to speak and the district attorney represents the people, which is all of us, right? Everyone in the community, but there's no victim spokesperson. But there's a lot of media there, like, and New York Post is there, Daily News, New York Times, everyone shows up to these hearings. And it can be very challenging for the family to go to those hearings and hear all about the defendant, basically like cursing and like saying why they should be free. There's no vehicle for which them to where they can speak other than to media. So in that instance, one of the things we provided was that we personally would go to the hearings and report back to the family.
And associates have that role also that,
Right.
are
Our associates would go interact with the ADA. We would do pre-meetings with the ADA to understand what the hearing would be about and not put the families through the pain of having to hear in great detail again about the charges and what happened to Michelle. Right.
So you're acting as a kind of a front person, as it were,
Right.
for the family. So they don't have to actually go and interact with all of these
ADA.
different offices and actors in public. You know how the game is played, you know what procedures are, you know whether there's an opportunity to speak, and they don't even have to come.
And they're so devastated in grief that it
Yeah.
would be really difficult for them to make rational decisions.
you're a
So,
buffer.
one of the things I think with Michelle's family was like, you might think that they're pushing on charges, but the thing they really wanted were the earrings that she had on when she fell and they never found, which no one, it could be in the subway, who knows?
Right.
And so, but if you talk to the ADA about that, there are times you can bring that up and there are times you can't, right? It may not be for the people to focus on the lost earrings, right? And then there's, I think you can talk about the probate issues, but most of our victims have died intestate without a will, and then you can't access their apartment. The family can't get into her apartment and you have to go file in surrogate's court to get the, kind of letters of administration for the estate to even get access to her belongings. And that can take a year, right? So for all of you who don't have like, kind of trust in the estates, like you should have one so that your family,
Even if you're
young, right? Michelle was very young. She didn't have one. And so family couldn't access her belongings and her apartment and, all these things. And you had to go petition in surrogate's court, right?
Yeah,
To be next to kin.
we've had to coordinate with police on crime scenes.
Crime
and getting
scenes,
things
clean up.
done.
Yeah.
Is there any role that you play in terms of assisting the investigation?
I think the police have come to believe that we can be helpful because oftentimes our victims, not Michelle, obviously she passed away, but a lot of times victims won't speak directly to the police except if we're there. They want a lawyer present because if you're an undocumented person, it's really scary to speak to the police. So an example would be sort of the duck sauce killing. The widow of
Maybe you could just explain that was
this was a delivery man in Queens and Forest Hills who was killed while he was on a scooter.
Joe yeah.
And doing it
in the spring.
His widow is undocumented. They have 3 kids who are legal citizens, but the widow is undocumented. He actually had relevant evidence as to sort of the interactions with, I think the defendant who had eventually killed himself, but was the one charged and was probably the perpetrator, right? Most likely. And that they had these interactions or fights. But she was scared to talk to the police because she's undocumented and she was concerned she'd get deported. She's actually already subject to an order of removal already, like even before this crime happened. And so if you have people who don't trust legal institutions, the evidence was never going to get to the DA. And if it doesn't get to the DA, they're not going to prosecute.
Mhm.
And if that's the case, where they didn't make an arrest for 30 days, we held a press conference and they made an arrest the
Yeah,
next day.
finally.
Right.
Mhm, mhm.
So those are the things, yeah.
But so, one thing to think about, sort of why we do this is if, if one of us is a victim of a crime, by and large, you've got family, you've got friends, you've got your law school professor, you've got, a support network. Chances are you're not undocumented. Chances are you're not going to be as afraid of the police as an undocumented immigrant. There's a whole bunch of advantages that we bring to the table as folks who are in the positions that we are right now. But when we're dealing with a lot of the crime victims and their families, they don't have those advantages, and they need someone to help them with, it's okay to talk to the police about this. It's okay, they're not going to deport you.
Mm.
This is what we need to do right now about medical care. These are the hospitals that we have contacts at that we can, this is how you can get back into the victim's apartment.
Mm.
Oh, you need this in order to bury the victim. Okay, we can arrange with the police to do that. There's all these support things. We talked about the intestate, often the victim is intestate. That's, so it's not just litigators who can get involved, and that's why I'm here. I mean, I'm a transactional guy, I'm a restructuring guy. What am I doing here? I find myself often giving people advice about what about their GoFundMe. Think about it. The person may not have seen this much money at once, ever in their entire life. And then all of a sudden this all comes in, and then it's just like you won the lottery, or although it's not the kind of lottery that you want to win. But all of a sudden it has all that lottery effect, and then there's all these hangers on who want to come after you. And the problem is, a lot of times these community organizations, certain of them are not helpful, that they are actually trying to say, we'll set up a GoFundMe for you, but you have to give us 10%.
So yeah, community organizations are not set
They're
up
not all
for direct,
bad.
they're
They're
not
not
all
all
bad,
bad.
but they're not set up for direct aid. And so I thought it was interesting you mentioned Legal Defense Fund, but Asian American Legal Defense Fund does no direct aid, even though they've taken in huge amounts of money for Asian American hate, right? The Asian American hate work that's being done for direct aid to be done pro bono by firms like us for no money. So when you give money to community organizations, it's not clear what it's being used for all the time. It might be used for social media rallies and parties, right, to promote the issue. There's nothing wrong with that, but very little of it is going in direct aid to the victims, right? And with respect to GoFundMe in particular, they won't give money to anyone who doesn't have a social security number in the US. That is an extreme sort of bar to most of the victims who are undocumented, right? So you have all this money being donated, and then you say to them, you can't have it. And then GoFundMe is like, we'll find an American trustee and form a trust.
So that's what we do.
So that's what we do, form a trust. And then we got to find a reliable trustee who speaks English, who's a US citizen, who's willing to deal with the administration of the trust.
That's how Judge Go got
how Judge Go
involved,
got
because, in our first one of these, the Yao Pan Ma case, she became the trustee of the trust. And, sometimes the trustee is readily available, sometimes it's not. But that's one of the mechanisms that we use in order to get funding to people who are undocumented. Furthermore, putting things in a trust like that, to the extent that they're on government assistance, it doesn't count as, it is not reportable as income in general. And so therefore, they don't get kicked out of their government housing. They don't, get knocked out of whatever other assistance they have. We have to be sensitive to the whole victim and the whole family, not just the criminal side of things. And so that's why, you talk about me being a pastor. This is just, this is caring about the whole human being. This is caring about all the needs of the person. One victim had a business that they needed to run, and the person who passed away was a central part of the business. And so I'm sitting there saying, well, the person who passed away was intestate and the shares were in his name, and there's no instrument for the shares of the company to pass on to you. And so now they're in his estate. We have to go through a probate process. In the meantime, how are you going to operate the business? And all of a sudden it starts sounding like an M&A transaction. And so, I'm thinking about operating covenants, total return swaps, things like that. When I think about how to deal with a situation like
Yeah, the breadth of roles that you've just laid out, it's kind of astonishing. I mean, I've just been making a little list. So you're helping them to deal with an estate. You're helping them to possibly, restructure or hand on the business operations. You're helping them gain access to services like
Healthcare,
healthcare, medical, housing, right? You're interfacing with them, with the DA's office, the prosecutor,
the
with
media.
the media, with the public, with community organizations. And you're sometimes helping to collect evidence or letting the police know that there is
Right.
evidence that.
if there is evidence, we'll let them know.
That it exists. Yeah, you're not taking the deposition or something, but you're helping. So this is a very wide range of functions and skills. And this wasn't your day jobs. So
No.
how did you jump into this? And have you had to do some retooling? Have you been able to augment your own skill sets by drawing on associates from across the firm, perhaps?
We have like 20 something associates who help us, and they're amazing. And I think one of the amazing things about doing this work is I learned more about them personally than I do kind of just doing patent litigation. So some of them will say, my mom was an immigrant from Korea and she was actually a teacher and then she had to run a laundromat. So this really, kind of pains me. And so it gives a space for people to talk about experiences, particularly as children of immigrants, that we don't normally talk about in the law firm. Like we tend to, in Professor Yoshino's words, cover the parts of us that are not similar to those who are, kind of in the majority. Maybe that's the best way to put it, right? So I might not say, I grew up, my first language is Chinese. I didn't speak English till I was 6. So I'm intuitive in that I can figure out real without you speaking, because for a long time, I didn't know what people were saying, right? I didn't speak English, right? And I think that skill that I had is very useful for this kind of work, because even if someone says to me, yes, I can tell if they mean no, right? I can tell if, so example is like Larry got a question from that victim, with the restructuring victim, who said, well, even though like I don't have access to the state now, I have their ATM card, the person who died, and can I use it to withdraw money? And that's a very challenging situation, because she was like, I don't have any money. And we had to nicely say, it's not good to kind of commit ATM fraud. Can you find a different way to get the money, right? But I think that what you're trying to do is convey to the victim that I'm not too good for you. I'm not entitled. I don't think that like your problems are nothing because I'm a lawyer at a law firm, and to speak at a level that they trust you like family. And in terms of retooling, right? I mean, I think this quote in the room is very appropriate, which is what drives us to action is when an injustice affronts our sight. So if it was my own family that was a victim, right? If my own sister was Michelle Go, if my own mother was, Ziwen Yang's widow, Eva Zhao, I think I would treat them with the same care. And in the same way that we as children of immigrants have taken care of my parents, like through the years, my relatives, like they don't speak perfect English. So asking for directions, protecting them from bias, when people call them names, shuffling them, getting out of danger, whatever it is, navigating the legal system. My mother, when she had to go to jury duty, was super confused. My dad, when he got a parking ticket, was like, how do I pay
I
it?
go to jury duty, I'm super confused.
Yeah, it's confusing, right? And so, when they have legal questions, they ask me like, oh, we got in a car accident. How do I deal with insurance claims? Well, all those things. And then one of the things that, kind of I've had a non-linear path to law. I was a healthcare consultant before I came to NYU. And I never thought I would be, where I am now, I would say. I never, this wasn't my dream. I wasn't born in the cradle becoming a lawyer. It's a biochemistry major.
You wouldn't know it now.
And one of the things people I met in healthcare consulting was I had consulted for Mount Sinai, and my mentor there is now the first woman chief operating officer of Sinai. And so I call her sometimes when I need help on these cases to say, can you smooth the path to getting medical services? And I think one of the things that's helped me is in my life, because my parents they're first generation immigrants, they're not connected to anyone in the community. I'm good at building community because those are the people I have. I'm good at meeting people and becoming friends with because I can see what their life is like, even if it's not my life, if that makes sense. And so I think that it's not so much retooling, but the same things that we do for our corporate clients. Like when a corporate client calls and they want a tax thing solved, we don't go, oh, I'm not a tax lawyer. So, sorry, go somewhere else. You say, no, I'll find you a tax
You
lawyer.
have to know, you have to know enough so that you know that there's a problem. And then you find someone in the firm who can solve the problem.
And you don't sleep. So
It's sort of what
they
a
can
general
sleep.
counsel does, by the way.
Right.
Sort of what a general counsel does. General counsel's role is to figure out when there is a problem and go, I don't think I can solve this. I better call a lawyer.
Right.
Which is why issue spotting is a big feature of exams.
Shameless plug for
Yeah.
hypotheticals and issue spotters.
In Iraq.
I want to open it up to questions from the room, both the online room and the physical room here. So we'll just show hands or use some other method to get my attention. Okay, this gentleman first, and then Bruce, and I think down there with Professor Chun. So yes, please.
So thanks so much. It's very educational, fascinating, and helpful. So you mentioned that the penalty for the crime in terms of the this adding 2 years or something.
Oftentimes only 2 years
Yeah.
to like assault one.
So
Yeah.
that's very depressing to hear. And so the two-part question: what can be done to sort of change that part of the law? And the second question is, being that you're sort of the insiders and with the families and with the ADAs in terms of safety, in terms of individual safety moving forward, what are you seeing in terms of what law enforcement is doing in terms of changing how they protect these? What are you seeing from your vantage point?
So maybe start with the second part and come back to the penalty enhancement. But the second part is, law enforcement by and large is just they're frustrated. I think we know that, right? They feel like they make arrests and people just get let out on bail, right? They don't feel like that their jobs are being valued. But there is a hate crimes task force, and it's composed of voluntary police who voluntarily dedicate additional hours of their time, all of whom are Asian language speaking, to basically commit to this issue because they see their own families in the faces of these victims. And so we actually get referrals for our cases from the hate crimes task force. The police officers will text me directly, say, can you help them? Because they know that we're doing it for free and we won't take a 10% cut of the GoFundMe. And they know that we're good for it, right? Grace Meng will call me directly. Congressperson Grace Meng will call me directly and refer cases to me because they know that we'll do it.
And then they'll know that will be helpful.
It will be helpful and that we won't speak to the media and that we'll, sort of like take care of these issues in a way that's upfront. So from a law enforcement perspective, I think they genuinely do want to do the right thing. Like I think I spent last year on my birthday in court watching the indictment of Gui Ma's killer, who she was the grandmother of sweeping in Queens and she got beaten. And the poor arresting officer there was all of 23 years old and he had never seen a crime. And he said that before he rounded the corner to make the arrest, he could smell her blood before, and it was pouring off the sidewalk because that's how badly bashed in her head was. And he was just in shock. And he's a 23-year-old, new rookie police, and he had to testify for the first time before a grand jury. And the poor gentleman was in tears. Like I was in tears, he was in tears, my client was in tears, the husband of Gui Ma. We were all down in Queens criminal court together with the prosecutor who was sort of a rookie prosecutor as well. But I think everyone is trying their best. But I don't think that there's a concerted effort to say protect Asian Americans above all else, nor should there be, perhaps, right? But what I think it is that the police, most of the people who are committing these crimes are repeat offenders. So it's somebody who's been arrested for a robbery, someone who's oftentimes they're people without a home, who they've seen repeatedly in that case underneath the scaffolding, he threatened other people. But when they made an arrest, he was just let go because these are kind of, death, what they call DAT crimes. You just get a death ticket, you just come back. And oftentimes they don't show back up, but if you don't have a home, they can't find you. So these are people, if you look at their record, 20 previous arrests, including, 1 a week prior for stealing a bicycle. But because their arrests don't lead to anything, they're demoralized, right? And then when they see crimes of this magnitude, they ask me the question you asked me, which is, what more can I do to stop this from happening? And so I do think that, one of the things, and this is very life affirming, one of the things about that Gui Ma case where, you could smell the blood pouring off the sidewalk before it came, was that there was an undocumented delivery man who's Mexican And the guy who had beaten her with the rock was still menacing everyone else. He had this big rock that was bloody and he was going to try to hit other people. And this Mexican gentleman, stayed around because he said what happened to that Chinese lady was wrong. And he ended up being the sole eyewitness who ID'd the guy to make the arrest, to get the indictment. And he then took a day off work to come with the translator. He testified in the grand jury for the indictment. And literally, like, Guaima's husband cried and like hugged him. They had these translators. No, we don't need to translate. They just cried and hugged each other. Because even in the midst of all this pain, there is this shared humanity that human life has value. And we all are more similar than we're not. But I think the way that the media portrays it is like law enforcement versus like defendants, or like it's adversarial. But what I see from the inside is that it's not adversarial. It's just very sad. It's very, very sad, right? But we are in it together. Like the police are in it together. The DA is in it together. The victim, the witnesses, even sometimes the defendant, like the Michelle Go family, doesn't fault the defendant for killing their daughter. He was in and out of mental institutions. He actually said to his, to Bellevue, if you let me out, I'm going to push a woman off the subway. And that was reported in the New York Times.
Before he shoved
A couple
Michelle
of years before.
Mhm.
And then, of course, they let him out. And then he went to a homeless shelter. And he didn't take his meds. His family couldn't deal with him. And he did what he did. And he was not, he didn't run from the crime. He was waiting to be arrested. This is somebody who needed help. And so when you think about like an adversarial system as like plaintiffs versus defendants and victims versus perpetrators, not all our victims believe that it's adversarial. They believe society is broken in a way that we all need to be part of the solution, not that someone did this to me and now I want revenge. That's relatively, that might be the initial reaction, but then you back up for a second and you say, you know what, there's something wrong with the system.
And you help your client process that through.
Yeah.
So is there a restorative justice program for
Well,
these
in
kinds
this
of
case,
crimes?
in Michelle Go's case, I think there is some advocacy that the family wants to do in terms of mental health outcomes, what we do for people, because mental health it just takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of legwork. It takes a lot of dedication, attention to detail, often things that government is not so good at. Okay, the attention to detail, the persistence, the consistency. And so there, some of our clients want to be advocates for things that are important to them. And this is one of them.
And so from the perspective, like kind of like formal restorative justice, which, as you may know, is a program in which the defendant and like the victim meet and they try to mediate some sort of like resolution. And, it's very, kind of, a lot of prosecutors talk about that, but none of our victims' families have been referred for restorative justice. We've asked, right, the DAs whether they think it's a good idea. Most ADAs think that in these circumstances, it's not helpful. So if the defendant is mentally ill, that's not going to be a promising thing. There's often the case of like, even if they're not mentally ill, they're denying that the event happened, then it's hard to have restorative justice when they deny that there's even a murder, right? And then there's often a language barrier. So we haven't talked about this aspect of it, which is in court, if you don't speak English, your translator is your voice. This is really important because there's only like 10 court certified Asian translators like in the entire court system.
For all Asian languages?
For like, at least for Chinese and Korean, it's really hard to find a good court certified translator. Right. And we got our referral through Attorney General Loretta Lynch, who's one of our partners, because there's someone she's used in Eastern District that we've been using. And then we got referrals from there. A lot of the court certified translators also don't know how to speak in the voice of the victim. And so many of our victims were the surviving widows, or there's a woman who got hit. There are a lot of male translators and it doesn't quite fit, right? So if you have a monotone translator, I feel so hurt. That's not the same as a woman saying, I was devastated by the death of my husband. And I think, as some of you know, because you're Chinese, in Chinese, the words for he and she are the same. So when they say they hit me, it's not clear if it's he or she. And I know, gender norms aside, right? But this might become a relevant fact as to who the perpetrator was, a woman or a man, right? And so they have to be sensitive to cultural issues like that and speak with the victim in advance. And so finding a court certified translator is incredibly difficult. And so we actually pay for the translators to go to court with the ADA, because otherwise they're using some terrible translator and I had this experience in Queens where we go in with like what they say is a detective who speaks Chinese, and he's supposed to speak Mandarin. When we get there, he only speaks Cantonese. So I end up doing the translation, which like I speak Chinese, but I don't know all the right words. So I'm saying things like the person who sits on the bench who normally wears a wig. And they're like, Pakwan, the judge. And I was like, yes, the judge, right? Because my parents didn't teach me legal words growing up, right? And so right, Pakwan, well, now, right? I think, you know, and so it becomes this situation where it was shocking to me how culturally unaware our ADAs are, and probably because the spike in anti-Asian hate crimes is new. We're actually having Hannah Yu, who's the head of hate crimes, who's in the Manhattan DA's office over to our firm, I think in a week and a half, maybe, for the ADNI breakfast. So you all are welcome to join it via Zoom or in person. But she can talk about what it means to be Asian in an office that has no Asian people. And so they're not familiar with Asian cultural issues. They bring translators who don't speak the language. That further confirms to the community that they don't care about Asian people, but it's literally out of like cultural unawareness. So another thing that like happened, and this gives you an example why I think our role is necessary, is in the sort of Ziwan Yang delivery gentleman's, you know, death, after the defendant killed himself, he committed suicide before he was tried. The information was conveyed to us in a live meeting with the ADA. And the ADA said to this poor widow, who's an undocumented immigrant with 3 young children, no way of supporting herself right now, and just very devastated, that, do you feel better now that the killer is dead? And she just starts sobbing because, you know what? She doesn't feel better because she's a lonely immigrant in this country with like just delivering laundry, and she's trying to, like, she doesn't know what to do. And then the ADA just kept pressing. She kept saying, you should feel better. You should feel better. Because it was clear the ADA is somebody who grew up here, who has family, who could have a life, even if her husband had passed away. But what we have is an immigrant where all of her family, her parents, her relatives, everyone was in China, right? And her decision was, should I stay in America or not? So it did not make her feel better that the killer was dead. And she didn't say, good. She just said, what a waste, 2 human lives lost. Right. And so culturally, and maybe, I think she's Buddhist, right? I'm Buddhist, right? So like, there's a system that in our justice system upon the ADAs, it's almost as if it's like the anti-restorative justice, that we believe that revenge gets you your justice. So justice is throwing someone in jail and having them never come out and hit someone. That might be one form of justice, but for many of our victims, justice is just being able to survive, right? And having the ADA say, well, I got you your justice, this person's dead, you don't have to worry, now you can feel safe. The victim felt anything but safe. She felt scared, alone, and here's this
Especially
woman.
because he shot himself with a gun that
He supposedly
shouldn't
didn't have. They represented he had no guns in his house arrest, and he was living 5 blocks from her, where she regularly delivers laundry in an apartment building.
So she was still in danger.
Yeah.
Bruce, you had a question?
Yes, I'd like to circle back to how you set up this pro bono program in the first place,
Oh my goodness.
which is I'm very interested in. I know Catherine touched upon improving your skill sets and
You
getting
got a
ready.
call, you
But-
called me.
But specifically, here's what I'm specifically interested in. Of course, we all know for existing pro bono programs, back in the 80s and 90s when I was practicing, AIDS, people are dying of AIDS need wills. We know the associates aren't used to T&E, but we'll train you. And we have sample forms you can use. I mean, I think that's typical of a pre-existing pro bono program. So presumably there's no playbook, no forms for what you did. And Jennifer mentioned you have associates, and Larry mentioned, well, yes, spot the issues like a good general counsel would. And those are all great things once you're going. How do you get the 20 associates? How do you get the firm on board? How do you initially gear yourselves up to undertake what has become a very large and substantial project?
Yeah, I think our firm is, and one of the things about Paul Weiss that makes Paul Weiss the firm is that, we have a dedication to pro bono causes. And so there was already this willingness in the firm. And if this is important to you, you ask firms, are they willing to put their associate hours and their partner hours where their mouth is? And this firm, from top to bottom, from Brad
Day one.
Karp,
Yeah.
the chair of the firm, all the way down to, the paralegals that we use on the cases. There's been support. So that's something you ask if this is important to you, of course, after you get the offer.
Yeah.
But
Or even before.
yeah, if you're brave. Yeah.
We have to do the right thing. The firm has always done the right thing. Like, so we got a call about the outpaying lot cat case. I emailed it around
That was
immediately.
the first one that
The
came
first time
to
we
you.
did, the man who was in Parliament was in Kansas and got beaten,
Right.
kind of randomly attacked. And he hasn't been tried yet by the defendant. That just goes to show how long these things take. I mean, he was attacked in, more than a year ago, right? A year and a half. So, basically like the firm, Brad Karp was our firm to immediately said, absolutely, we need to support this effort. And what's nice about the firm is you can make your own path. There's no micromanagement, like, well, how are you going to build this? How are you going to serve them? How are you going to do this? What they did do was say, I think you could use some help from Loretta Lynch. And I will ever be grateful for her for spending 3 hours on Zoom with me on the night of President Biden's first presidential address to the nation, teaching me criminal law. Jen, this is what indictment is. This is what does.
This is where
This is how I prosecuted, the Lima case, right? Like, she's been there. She wrote literally the day after we met them in Chinatown. And then I think a day later, I was like speaking at a press conference at the site of the murder in Harlem. And Loretta helped me write the talking points. This is what you say on behalf of the family. Don't say more. Support law, right? Like, this is how you don't jeopardize the criminal investigation. So it was like this whirlwind experience where I felt that the firm was wholly supportive of making sure that I would be fully prepared for something that I was not prepared for as a patent litigator at all. Right. I'd never dealt with criminal law in my life. I'd never been a victim of crime. And so I didn't know the first thing about indictments and grand juries and all that. And immediately all of our former prosecutors of the firm jumped in and said, anything you need, we're here to help you. And that, that's how you build a business practice, but that's also how you build a pro bono practice. And the associates were more than excited to come. Like, our firm was still closed from the pandemic. They reopened the doors so that we could meet with our victims who didn't have cell phones and didn't have Zoom, didn't have computers, to come to our office. The only people in our office were essentially like us doing in our victims with translators and sometimes Zoom translators. And I will say with great gratitude to our associates for committing so many, hours, because they personally cared about these issues. I mean, it was pretty amazing.
So we have a number of questions coming in also from the people online, and Professor Chun had a question, so I'll let you go next and then I'll tee up one of the online questions.
Okay. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing. I came here in October, and the increase of hate crime against Asians really concerns me. My first question has to do with the victims. Have you ever met victims who felt victims of hate crime because of race and gender? I mean, have you ever had any victims that suffered because of hatred against the Asian women?
Yes.
Yeah.
And my second
All the-
question,
yeah.
and my second question has
Disproportionately.
to do
Most
with
Asian women.
the perpetrators. Have you ever dealt with cases where the perpetrator is an Asian? Recall that a couple months ago, there was a mass shooting in California.
Yes, the
where
Taiwanese.
the Taiwanese people shoot Taiwanese people, and I think that the DA there said that he was considering prosecuting the case as a hate crime. So I'm just wondering whether or not you have encountered any cases here where it's a Asian hate crime.
Not in New York. I don't think, I mean.
Not any of our cases are like that.
Right.
Always it's a different race.
Because it would be more difficult to deal with the Asian community when you have a case that Asian
Right,
against the Asian.
right. But it is possible. It is possible to have, two different groups against each other.
Right.
Unfortunately, yes.
And I think Asian women are disproportionately attacked because they're perceived as weaker or submissive. I think women in general are being attacked more, in the subways or, on the streets because they look like they're smaller stature. They won't push back. And that kind of, that's a fear, I think, of even our associates who are Asian women who work on our cases asking about it. And Larry, to his credit, has offered us like protection from that. Pepper spray and others, right? I mean, Larry's
All
always good about it.
legal pepper spray, all legal carry.
All legal carry, right? But even, now I have been out at night where some of my male colleagues will say, can I make sure I walk you home, right? Like, there is a concern there about
I
the
do that
issues,
with alarming regularity.
right? And I think that's the world in which we live.
So one of the online participants is asking, how can we mitigate the divide in the Asian American or the AAPI communities through how we interact with and share media in our own personal spaces? How should we be interpreting media coverage or hate crimes for cases like Michelle Go? So I'm not entirely sure. I wish this person were here to explain the question more fully, but it sounds as if it's basically saying, what should individuals who are members of this community be doing in their own interactions and reactions and responses?
So I don't always trust the GoFundMes that are being started because I don't know where it's going, right? Like a lot of times the community activists are taking it or whatever it is, right? So I would honestly volunteer for these cases, whether it's with Paul Weiss or through the Asian American Bar Association has what's called a heart response task force. Anyone can join it. Law students can join it. And you basically assist in these cases pro bono. Direct aid means you know where your aid
And you
is
don't
going.
need to be an attorney.
You don't need to be an attorney.
My
But can you
daughter,
tell
who is in
me-
college, is
It's
doing
called the
something.
HEART. It's like Hate Eradication
Yeah.
Action Response Team. I think it's
HEA.
HEART. You can look it up on the Asian American Bar Association of New York's website. And I want to
Albany.
Abney. give a shout out to Abney and their director, Young Chen, who started this.
AABNY.
AABAN, Asian American Bar Association of New York.
Okay.
Anyone can join it. We have law students on that team and we have weekly meetings on Friday over Zoom at 11 a.m. where we discuss these issues. And then when the cases come in, you can work on them directly. So you will know where your money or your time is going. But if you just give money to community organizations, they don't have lawyers on staff doing T&E. They don't have lawyers doing like U visas. Like so one of the things we do is immigration status. If you're the victim of a crime, you can get immigration
And
status
family.
here and family. And so we're filing for those U visas for these families. And so there's a lot that can be done, but most of the community organizations aren't staffed up to do it. Because historically there wasn't an issue with this. So why would they hire an immigration lawyer? Why would they hire a trusted states lawyer? They don't have the capacity or capability. So other big law firms are filling that need with pro bono. Eventually they might hire an immigration lawyer. But right when we asked around to find an immigration lawyer for some of our victims, every single one was going to charge money. Nobody was going to do it pro bono. Right. And how do you ask a family that just lost a loved one, even if they have money, to pay for these services? It just seemed outrageous to us. Right. So, you know, I think that in social media and media, they just want the media hit of like eyeballs, people looking at the issue. We're looking for longer term solutions of supporting these families through the journey and not just immediately when it goes away.
And maybe justice looks like something other than a verdict, other than sending the person to jail. Like, you know, maybe justice is advocacy for mental health outcomes that will help society deal with this. That's what justice looks like for
Michelle Go's
Michelle Go's family.
So that is a nice segue to another question, which is what can we do? What can the community do to advocate for access to more mental health resources or restorative justice practices? What
On
should,
restorative justice, this is the easy one.
Mm.
All district attorneys are elected. How many of you voted for a district attorney in the last session? There was a field of 12 people. I probably supported all 12. I gave money to all of them. How many of you went to the Zooms? How many of you took the flyers? How many of you know the position of your district attorney? These are elected positions that are won by 200 votes. If you just told your friends, you would swing the vote, right? But we don't seem to understand that our district attorneys, our law enforcement officials are elected. We in the Asian community, by and large, don't seem to like coalesce around the positions we want in the legal justice system. So then when we raise up and say, we want this for our community, they say, who are you? Who are you? Right? I went to Alvin Bragg. So Alvin Bragg's a friend of the firm. He speaks to our summer associates every year. And he's, you know, and he came and he did a Zoom. And my question, he said, I'm a son of Harlem and I've been shot and all this stuff. And I said, that's great, Alvin. Are you also a son of Chinatown? You're going to be sitting in the heart of Chinatown City Hall. Are you a son of Chinatown? And that woke him up. And he then emailed me and said, I'd like you to work on my, like, you know, kind of hate crime policy paper. Right. But we need people who look like Larry and me to show up to these like elected official things. You can give $5, you can give $10. It's not a huge amount of money to win these races. A lot of people are independently funded. Right? We have billionaires who are running for these offices. But if you don't show up, you can't assume that you're going to have a voice. And one of the things that we've done effectively at Paul Weiss is lean on the connections we have with our Jewish partners, our Black partners, our partners in other areas who have historically donated and participated in the political process. And I'll call them and they'll call the DA for me, or they'll make an intro, right? Because historically, and now that I know this, right, I donate to every DA election. I literally donate to every candidate. And go to every one of their Zooms because I want to understand what their position is. So
You donate to every candidate so that if they win, you can say,
So
I supported
it's
you.
it's the gating function to getting into the Zoom with them.
Yeah, you can't be in the Zoom.
Oh, you
unless
can't be in the
something.
Zoom
Yeah,
unless.
they
you
don't
get
have open
licensed.
Zooms per se, but they say we're having a
So
fundraiser Zoom.
it's a door ticket.
It's a door ticket, but you can donate $1. No one's saying there's an amount you have to donate. No one looks at the amount as far as I can tell. But the city, I think, matches 6 to 1. So every dollar is $6.
Ah,
So they're just looking for small donors and you're kind of capped at 250 or something, right? So
right.
and the amount of money is not extreme. So you could give $1 and that's $6. So the city has this like kind of, they do that on purpose so that people have, it's basically more equitable.
Right.
And I think what's important about that isn't that I'm influencing their decisions, but I just want to know who's taking care of my community.
Mhm.
Like, wouldn't you want to know, like, I know we all focus on the Trump v. Biden election, but for me personally, who's my DA is actually more meaningful to me in my city.
Mhm.
And I know we like all focus on the Eric Adams versus whoever mayoral race. But for me, what's more important is who's the district attorney who, when something happens, is going to prosecute,
Mhm.
right? And so we pay so little attention to the district attorney race,
Mhm.
right? But the Alvin Bragg race next time is going to be challenged. He's not, like, he's not necessarily true. He's going to get reelected, right? Like Morgenthau, right? Like our Cy Vance. So I think people should care. And then every time in Queens, there's like basically no Asian people in the Queens DA office. Even Queens, almost like there's so many Asian people. Can't find a translator yet. I'm getting like a Cantonese translator in Queens. Why don't they know what Mandarin is?
Mm.
Right. And so one of the nice things that come out of this is a lot of the victims, their kids, they want to be the DA now.
Ah.
They ask me not how do I have your job? They ask me how do I become the district attorney?
They see where the power is.
That's right. Right. And it's not about money.
Well, they
It's
see where
about
they can have it.
have an impact, right? Of saying like, who can make Asian people feel comfortable that when you're hurt, that we will take care of you. That's usually the district attorney. District attorney's offices are struggling with the intake, and struggling to find people. Like they're bleeding people out of their office because it's not like necessarily the best job in the world.
Mhm.
And so we need more people
Doesn't
who are
pay
Asian
enough and they come
to
work for
go
us
be
instead.
prosecutors and to
Right.
care, right? And a lot of them are great people who didn't use anymore.
Well, one of the issues that was raised in the Endless Tide report that I mentioned at the beginning, which was prepared by the Asian American
Which we
Bar
co-authored,
Bar
right?
Association of New York.
Yeah.
One of the issues that they raised was a perception by the AAPI community that their voices are not heard, that when they try to report an incident, it's not necessarily heard. So they gave a couple of told a couple of stories, instances in which individuals tried to report incidents and no record was taken, no follow-up action was taken, there was no investigation, and certainly there was no prosecution. Do you think, from your experience, that that is unusual with respect to this community, or is that just
That's common. We've sent in
common for
videos.
all communities?
Common for all communities.
Uh-huh.
There's just too many crimes for them to take on. So we've emailed the Queens Hate Crimes Unit, Michael Brosner, with videos of like someone shouting Asian epithets
Mhm.
to elevate the crime. And the next day it got elevated to hate crime when it originally was just being prosecuted as misdemeanor,
Mhm.
right?
So there's not opposition to it, it's just that they're overwhelmed.
They're
by the
not-
volume?
They're not listening because it's too hard to process all the voices.
Yeah.
But if you have outside counsel like us,
Yeah.
we can try to cut through the noise and say, really, you have to pay attention to
Because
this.
we'll know who to send it to.
Right.
The
So
person.
you just send it into the ether, it doesn't necessarily.
And if you're just outside picketing the DA's office, they don't, right? And particularly if the people who are picketing are not people who are voting for the DA, but,
Right.
you know, like, what's the meaning of that? They're just sort of like your fair weather friends, like in the sense that you want this now, but come like the votes, you're not gonna vote, right?
So an effective response is not necessarily even a response on the streets or a mass protest of some kind. An effective response is to the top,
To the top,
targeted.
right? And that's what Larry and
And
I
that's what
are
you're
good at,
bringing.
because in part, we have the support of our firm. But we also have connections with Congressman Grace Meng and others, so that
Right.
one of the things we did for Michelle Go family was to set up a meeting with them and all of the elected officials in New York. at a private dinner. So they had access to the top. So they felt heard.
Yes.
And that was important to them to feel heard,
Yeah.
not just be screaming into the void.
My advice to Justin, who's Michelle's father, was, he showed me this card that he created, this kind of, that had the sentiments that encapsulated the sentiments that he had and the family had about Michelle. And he gave it to me and he said, I want you to have this. And I said, no, you should give this to, the folks at this dinner, because I already feel this, but you need to tell your story. You need to tell her story to these folks so that they feel it. So that,
They've never spoken to the media. But they've spoken to us and they've spoken to elected officials. They kind of through things that we've organized, and it's to give them a voice without feeling like sort of terrorized by the media, wanting a quote or wanting to see them crying or just getting that snapshot.
Right.
Right. It's not something they're going to be able to handle. And I think for an older generation, like crying on screen it's not like reality TV.
Right.
This is real life.
That's not dignified.
It's not dignified.
So I see two questions. So Amy and then you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation and for what you have done and have been doing for like Asian community. So like a lot of you are doing with the victims reminds me of the holistic service provided by, for example, neighborhood defenders who used to be like Bronx defenders. I'm just wondering whether there's any effort or discussions to form like legal aid organization that understand the need of Asian victims, that share a lot of institutional knowledge and skill sets, and just to have a like sort of collective effort to serve this community in particular, or it's just like every firm has their own way to do that. Or maybe like individual lawyers, they just contribute whatever they can or whatever they will to solve it.
There is no collective effort other than the Alliance for Asian American Justice, which is Don Liu's organization. So there's loosely the firms have meetings, so we share information that way.
also Albany.
Albany is the heart, so I report on that to them.
So
We've given
Albany is
trainings.
very important. I don't want to replace them because they've got a great organization. I'm actually on
They're
the board.
amazing, yeah.
I'm on the board, and Jen, you're co-chair of the Women's Committee. We don't want to create an organization. What we want to do is we want to help organizations do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think, it's different than Bronx defenders because that's like a high intake, but what we're providing is like really high-end legal service. Like our Trust in the State Department serves victims of Asian hate crime and Melinda Gates. Right? So the service we're providing is
The form of trust agreement is going to be similar.
right. We're probably, and we have templates for that. I'm not sure, like places like Bronx defenders, like they specialize in kind of criminal, right, proceedings and going to court. We're not going to court for our victims. We're handling everything else outside of court. So you're not going to get like corporate lawyers, right, at Bronx defenders. So I think we can't replace them and they can't replace us. It's just not the right fit, really, right? Because we're not going in and saying the defendant's right or the prosecution's right. We're simply just trying to find the solution that the victim wants us to have to make sure the victim feels heard. And they do feel heard because they see us go in and we speak and people listen when we speak because we're lawyers. And you shouldn't underestimate that if you're a lawyer, how powerful you are to people who feel disenfranchised in this country. Like the amount of like respect they have. They literally think that like we can, when we hold press conferences, like the media comes and they're sort of in awe of like this machinery that allows you to have access to people who are in power. And it's sad to me that people think that that's unattainable, but the reality is in a stratified society, only the elites, right, at this school have access to the top and everyone else is just struggling to kind of get by and has no trust in the country, which I think is the reason we have sort of like the Trumps of the world, right? I mean, not pejoratively, but like, they feel disenfranchised.
Hi, thanks for your information, and I have two questions. The first is, have you ever met some cases like related to domestic violence? Because the anti-Asian hate maybe have more influence in the intimate partner relate and more severe influence. And my second question is, once you want to like refer the victims to other resources, is it more helpful to like connect to the nonprofit organizations because they may have more like referral services.
So we tried, and there's almost no mental health services available. Like, we've tried so hard. Everyone wants counseling after this. There's almost nobody we can find to provide that to nonprofits. Nonprofits by and large are overwhelmed and also serving indigent populations. So you say, I have this victim, but they're alive, but they want mental health services in the long term, like 6 months of counseling. You literally cannot find that. And so there's a gaping hole there where like the nonprofits are used to serving people who are literally on the streets and have nowhere to go, provide food and shelter, get you food stamps, get you
There's
set
no
up.
victim services.
There's no victims. And then we call the victim services line, which the DA will refer you to, and you'll call them and they'll have nothing to give you. It's extremely but they're also overwhelmed, right? They're dealing with immediate need. Like, you're the victim of domestic violence. You need out right now. We'll find you a home. And you say, no, my victim's okay where they are, but they're just not feeling good, or they're feeling depressed. They don't know how to go forward. Their daughter died. Michelle
Or they're
Go.
drinking. I mean, that's
Right.
you know, when some of our client families, they, you know, some of the family members were dry for many years and then they started drinking.
Or like the Dwayne Moss family, the husband fell into deep depression, not immediately, but 6 months later. And when she eventually died after being in a coma, he didn't blame the perpetrator, he blamed the hospital. Right? And that just goes to show how little trust he has in institutions. By and large, they don't trust our nonprofit system because it feels like transactional.
Yeah, now on the domestic violence piece of it, that hasn't been a factor in any of the cases that we've had.
That's right. Yeah. They're mostly like random attacks where they don't know.
Yeah, it's the perpetrator doesn't know the victim.
So in May, President Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And before that, he had signed a number of executive actions that between the legislation and the executive actions, he was trying to do things like tee up some grant funds for police training, community outreach. He appointed someone to coordinate action across agencies. The Department of Justice set up an initiative to address hate crimes and to expedite review of the ability to prosecute as hate crimes. So in other words, a number of actions were taken, a lot of them having to do with the reporting and data processing and transparency around the situation. Have you assessed these measures? Do you, two questions, I guess. One is,
There's been any
have you
practical
seen anything happening on the ground
not
as a
practical.
result of any?
That's at the federal level, the response isn't going to be practical.
Mhm.
You might
Because
find
it's too
funding.
distant?
Law
It's just-
enforcement is a local.
It's like a DA issue. So they're saying we're going to give money to municipalities to track hate crimes.
Mhm.
If the police aren't writing it down, how do you track it?
Well, I mean,
It's
if
a
you look at
practical
our
issue.
system right now, this is part of what
Yeah.
was part of the report, the Omni.
Mm.
You know, my daughter kind of tried to figure out, oh, here's a hate crime, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. She creates a database.
Mhm.
And then she says, oh, well, this got this disposition, this was the arrest. And then she's kind of going, I don't know what happened.
Mhm.
And until there's a uniform reporting system that tracks longitudinally, we're not going to get the type of transparency that we need in order to figure out whether there is a result from any of this.
You're not required to report whether it's a hate crime or what the outcome is. And so you have. to,
But she had to
data.
do like she had
Right,
to
you
go
couldn't
to
find
5
it.
different systems to collate everything. And sometimes the systems are contradictory and
When you say different systems, do you mean across
Databases.
jurisdictions or within a single
within
jurisdiction?
our one jurisdiction, the police database, and the DA's piece, and then the news
Criminal news piece.
Right.
everything.
will be different. And sometimes you'll find something in one and not the other and not the other.
There's not always like a hate crime component. So there's a lot of it's not being tracked.
Right.
So if you can't track it, there's no way to figure out whether we're succeeding.
Or in the Amity report, I thought that was one of the things that was stressed a lot.
As a
This
recommendation.
idea of
Now, that's what I'm
Not-
saying.
not knowing,
That's
right. As you say, if you can't count it, if you can't track it, you can't prioritize it.
Yeah, the way that Grace Meng says it's like, can't count it, we can't allocate funding.
Right.
So we have to be able to count it to say this is a problem, and we're undercounting because we're not counting.
And none
then we're
of
not
the,
tracking.
none
We're
of
not
the
tracking.
executive actions or this Hate Crimes Act would provide
No.
funding for that.
No, it did provide funding, but it's not there's no, like, it's a technical solution that hasn't been made. Like,
Mm.
how do you get agencies to speak to one another?
Mhm.
That, we've never solved that problem,
Mhm.
right? Like, that's why we can't flag the mentally ill, because privacy prevents us from telling the homeless shelter that you're getting an
Organizations
intake,
are great at not talking to each other.
right? And so it's a technical issue. The databases don't talk to each other. So some human being has to track that down.
So what would need to happen for that first step in that direction? If the Hate Crimes Act being passed doesn't do it,
That's a federal
What-
response. It's a local issue. to
so we need a
say,
local New
the
York City
mayor said-
response.
The local response needs to be that we need to figure out a way to have some case
Mm.
that, and track the process of that case launch.
Just like when we recruit
all
law
of
students, I know you've been tracked, you've applied, your resume's in,
Mhm.
you're being interviewed second round. Okay, you came back for a callback. Okay, now you've accepted, or you have an offer, but you've accepted. We have dedicated people to track that one system.
Mhm.
How are you gonna get the police, to talk to the DA,
Mhm.
talk to like the criminal, to this, the court system?
And the mental health.
And the
system.
mental health system, the Bellevue, or whatever it is,
Mhm.
right, to all be in one. And I've heard from Steve Banks, who's the head of our pro bono, former director of kind of social services in New York.
Yes, the city service.
Social services is that, agencies just don't talk to one another.
Mhm.
It's basically virtually impossible to get agencies to speak to one another because they operate.
And
separate
it's great
spheres.
having Steve around because
He provides,
he can
so
tell
much
you what
information.
can and can't be done, how things are working and how things
Yeah.
aren't working and things like that. But yeah, it really is, it's really a morass of systems that are not designed to track
Mhm.
this.
Sure. Well,
So-
their legacy, right? I mean, they.
Yeah. There was never a thing.
you didn't want to track it, right? But now I do think privacy issues stand in the way of really
Right.
tracking it.
Yes.
Because if you have someone who went to the hospital and got validated
You
as
know,
being
mental
mentally
health
unfit,
outcome, yeah.
I don't have access to that information. I just
To
hear
HIPAA and all
hear
this
from the
stuff.
court that they've been designated. And one of the most frustrating things for these families, like the Michelle Go family, is you can't actually see the mental health report that is called 730 examination that designates defendants unfit. It gets sent to the prosecutor, so the prosecutor knows, defendant knows, but the victim's family is just totally in the dark.
Mhm.
They never can see that report for privacy reasons. And how does that feel like to them? It feels like not having closure.
Mhm. They can learn that it exists.
They don't know the why.
Mhm.
They don't know the why.
They don't know what type
And
of
that's
disease.
the,
Yeah.
that's the thing as a victim,
Mhm.
you don't know why. And
Mhm.
it's just this thing that happened to you and it's incredibly, and that's why a lot of victims, the why question is one of the most important
Right.
things that you can know as.
I would think in these, because in any kind of an attack, when somebody attacks you, mugs you on the street, obviously you're injured and you're scared. But if you know that you've been singled out for that because of what you look like or who you are in some way, that would make it more traumatic, I would think. Is there a single thing that victims find most satisfying or most healing of their trauma, an experience that they can have? Sometimes in crimes, you hear that meeting with the perpetrator is actually helpful. When you're dealing with somebody who's mentally ill, it doesn't seem like it fall into that category, but is there a particular experience or step or kind of
It's a one size
assurance?
fits all on this.
There is nothing that.
It's just when we show up for them repeatedly, like
Mhm.
I think Justin Go always says, we still have calls with him every month. And every time we get on the call with him, he says, I'm surprised you're still here.
Mhm.
He can't believe that we still care, like,
Mhm.
almost, a year after the attack, right? We met him a year ago,
Mhm.
right? So they have this insecurity of like, everybody's transactional. You're interested in me because of the immediate kid of this is horrible.
Mhm.
And then you're gonna just drop away.
Mhm.
So every time we show up, the longer we show up, they're just so surprised that we're still there for them,
Mhm.
that the ADA might still be there for them.
Mhm.
And
We're
they're
still spending the hour and a half or 2 or 3.
just
with them.
talking through, and they're still in grief.
Still
Mhm.
They're
processing.
still processing what happened. They're still going through newspapers from a year ago,
Sure.
trying to figure out like, what was the weather like that day? Did she have a coat on when she was in the subway? And they finally, she was wearing those earrings, so we couldn't find them in her apartment. She must have been wearing those earrings.
Right.
Right? And so you never, losing a child is, I have 3 children, so like, that is really, and Larry has 3 children, right? So it is not the normal course of nature. I don't think you ever survive that. And this family had actually lost another daughter at birth.
Mm.
And they have another son, but like, I think you can't, this is just like the why. What was she wearing? Why did she go in that subway? Was she going somewhere? Was she late? Was she early? You know, and it's not to say they haven't been embraced by the community, but everyone feels away. Everyone drops away.
Are there other questions in the room? Yes.
Can I just ask, out of curiosity, what did, like, Michelle Go's family choose to do with, like, all the money that was raised through, like, the GoFundMe?
I don't know if I want to share that,
Oh, sorry.
but different people do different things with the money. Some of them, you know, use it to defray medical expenses. If there is expense that they need to if there's money that they need to spend in order to, you know, deal with the case, there's that. Some folks have created a foundation to advocate for causes that they like. Other folks say, I just need the money and I just want to use it for, you know, personal
Yeah.
use. Different, again, not a one size fits all, but yeah,
And,
that's.
and the victims hate it when the donors ask what happened to the money. Because it feels like you're accountable to the donors. They would rather, they actually shut down their GoFundMe's when they get these questions. Because it feels like you gave for something back. Oh, you gave me money, but only if I give it to your organization. You gave me money, but only if it helps Asian women. Oh, you gave me money, but only if I use it for housing. And in a world in which you lost a family member, you lost all your control. Something was taken from you outside your control, and all you want is to control your life again. And all the donors, the media, the donors, the community organization telling you what to do. You have to choose a headstone, go to that cemetery, oh, cremate, oh, don't cremate, this coffin, that coffin, you know, all this stuff. That's incredibly stressful because all the donors are just taking away control from that family. So what we say is you can do whatever you want with that money. They say, do we have to tell the donors what I use it for? And we say, no. You use it for the things that you need to give you comfort in this time of grief, but you can't give it to us. It was like, they was trying to like give us stuff. Like, you try to give me a bag of rice. They try to give me test prep classes for my kids, right? They're like, you can't take money, I'll give you other stuff. I'm like, I don't, it's karma, right? They're like, you gave me something, I want to give you something back. So they offer us money. We can't take any of that. But when the donors say, well, what are you doing with that money? They feel like you've invaded their privacy. They're like, you don't know me. You don't know my family. Just because you gave me $5 or $100 doesn't mean you have access to my deepest, darkest moment. Right. And so I don't fault any of the donors for asking. I honestly don't. Because I think you give money, you see,
But
you know
also
what
a lot
happens
of
to
these
it. But it's
organizations don't
incredibly-
particularly like us. A lot of these organizations.
yeah, it's
don't
incredibly
like us
painful.
because we don't take it.
That question is the most painful question for our victims. What did you do with your money? Because that's invading, like they may have spent it on something that you might not find valuable. But who are you to judge that? Who are you to tell
I
them?
just lost my daughter. I decided to go out and buy a piece of chocolate cake.
Who, right? Like I decided to go out and do takeout for a year because I couldn't cook anymore. Right. And I don't know that that'd be true. No one's ever told me that. But the fact that someone's asking, like how many people ask all of you, how do you spend your money? Does
Except
it feel
for your
comfortable?
parents. Except
Right?
for your
My
parents.
parents, even when my parents ask me, I don't love that, right? I don't want someone looking at
I
my
hate
credit
that.
card bill.
I hate that.
But think about how many donors are asking you once you started GoFundMe.
So we just have a few minutes left. I wanted to, oh, okay, go ahead.
It's just a quick question with all of the talks about grief and sadness of your family. How do you not get discouraged with the system and everything that's going on? Because like through the presentation, it's very motivating, but look, if I were to internalize, I would have think that if it was me in your position, I would have been so affected and also grief with them. Like how do you balance that to stay motivated of what could have been, but also connect with the grief? Like how do you balance that and not bring the grief close?
So my answer is like, in order to be a good lawyer, you have to be happy yourself. Like your job at a big firm is to take on people's stress and anxiety, your general counsel, whoever, right? You can't do that if you're not stable yourself. If right, you have to take care of yourself. Literally, your general counsel is calling you and saying, my company is going bankrupt. I need you to solve this problem. If you feel personal stress somewhere else, they're probably not going to call you, first of all, because they're going to think you're already on the edge. So I think most lawyers recognize that mental health is really, really important in our jobs in general. And so when we take on the stresses of like someone dying or something like this, it's different than a corporate client calling, but it's not that different. You're essentially providing therapy for your client. And so you might internalize it a little bit, but it's your job. right? Like we operate under huge amounts of pressure. We operate with billion-dollar problems. We're like, if we, I'm a litigator, when we lose a case, like for my startup clients, everyone might get fired. That's not a comfortable position, but you learn that you either are someone who can take on that stress, or if you're not, then this isn't the right job for you. And I don't fault anyone for not wanting the job that we have right now.
Yeah, I think that the counseling aspect is very important. That as a counselor, you cannot be your client.
Right.
Their problem is not your problem. At the same time, you have to do things that act as if their problem is your problem. In other words, you need to put yourself into their place and see what you would do, in their place, and maybe suggest that, but you can't internalize what they have. That's theirs, first of all. But it really is just helping out. What do they need? What do they say they need? What do they really need? Is what they say they need good for them? That kind of thing, and help them think things through. It's being their friend, being their advocate. That's how I deal with it.
And I think some of them, like one person after working with me, like months later, after we had handled her case, came to me and was like, I just watched the partner track. Is that what your life is like? Because you must be going through a lot, right? And I said, oh, and it was based on our law firm, and the author is a friend of mine, right? And all of that, right? I was like, that's really nice of you to say, like, what would precipitate it? She's like, well, you've never expressed any kind of anxiety yourself, right? You've never complained about your other work. Every time she texts me at midnight, I respond. I don't like say, I have all this other stuff to do. I got my fit, right? I don't like blow off, but your client comes first, right? Whatever your feelings are about, like, I need to call my mom or I need to do my other case, you have to make every client feel like they're the only person in your world. And that's what we do. And so when you're thinking about, like, how do you not get affected? I actually think for me, if I feel like I'm breaking down and my client's also breaking down, that's sort of a selfish thing on my part. They've come to me, a total stranger, not a family member, to get like support. So if I'm talking about how I feel, then they're going to give me support. They're going to be like, are you okay? Right. And so I know that seems like contrary to our sort of like mental health thing of we just talk about our feelings all the time. But I find it less helpful to talk about how I feel about it, because it forces them to like focus on my feelings when I think all the focus should be on their feelings. Right. So when Justin Go is like talking about how he feels about his daughter, I don't say, well, I have this really important meeting next, so I got to go, right? Or like, I'm feeling stressed because I have a board presentation in a minute and I need to drop off. I just say, Justin, I'm with you. I really need to go. I'm going to call you later. Right. So I do think that if you're not, and I think I can say this, Larry, because I think publicly you said it. We've had partners in our firm say that the one thing they wish they knew about being a partner in a big law firm was how much stress you take on for other people, and that they wouldn't have done the job had they known. And one of those people has actually left, right? He actually decided to go part-time and then eventually left. So I think this is a good segue just to saying, like, know thyself and know like whether this is something that you want to take on. There's lots of ways to help. The way in which we're helping does require, as you kind of intuitively and aptly say, taking on a huge amount of stress. But we're also people who take on huge amounts of stress for other people in our non-pro bono work.
So with that, we'll have to close today's talk. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having
It's
us.
been truly fascinating and I hope helpful. And you all took note of the suggestions for how you also can get involved in supporting these kinds of cases. And thanks to those of you who joined us online.